And what I want to do initially is share with you the sort of criteria we developed then. Do some justification, I hope. Have to retreat on at least one thing. If you have a tough enough challenge, at least one of these areas I think is pretty shaky, but I'm not going to tell you any more in case you catch me out. So I leave it to you to do that. So let's ask ourselves as a starter for today, what are the criteria that you could hold up to a design to tell you whether that design is going to succeed in bringing about a change in performance? Well, when we began our work, the first criterion, when looking at a whole set of design criteria, was to do with the underlying model on which this was based. We asked ourselves, what's the evidence that there's a valid success model? I think the sort of discussion you will have had last week with Geary Rummler would be very much centered around the idea that there is some model to a performance. If your training doesn't change performance, what's it doing? In specifying a change, you're specifying that there is a desired outcome of some kind. But where do we get our evidence that a particular behavior or skill or outcome is the thing you should be training towards? Frequently, that evidence is lacking. Now, how serious is that? Well, if your training is not performance related, if you put on training as a kind of act of corporate goodwill and you measure your success through some kind of smiles test that people go away liking it, that's probably not a very important criterion. On the other hand, if the criterion by which you are being judged is performance change, then if you're teaching the wrong thing, the better you teach it, the worse the mess you're in. So one of the things which is becoming very evident is that the last 4 or 5 years have begun to evolve much, much more powerful methods of skills teaching. And as these methods have evolved, really fundamental questions come up. How do we know that the things we're teaching are the right things to teach? And where does that evidence come from? You've seen one approach which is very helpful in building a model in terms of performance analysis and some of the things that Gary was talking about. For me, though, I know when I looked through the masses of programs that we had around the wall, it was really very difficult to know, when you look at the program, whether the thing it was suggesting people should do as a performance was valid or not. I'll later come on to talk to you about particular studies we've done on what makes a valid success model. Anyway, let's move from our valid success models and look at another design criterion. For us, when we analyzed a lot of programs, we found that most of the programs we liked had an emphasis on the basic behaviors or skills. And this word basic is very important. I'll be saying at least 46 times and maybe 47 times during the morning that the biggest single fault in most training programs is that they try to do too much. They desperately overload the learner. Almost every program would be twice as effective if it contained half as much. The characteristic of almost any good design is that that design is fundamentally very simple, clean cut. It doesn't try to do too much. One aspect of that is that it has a very good understanding in the design of what constitutes a basic behavior or skill. Now for me, a very important differentiation is to be very clear that there are what we might call first-order skills and then second-order skills, or even possibly third-order. And let me make this distinction as clearly as I can. A first-order skill is the capacity to produce a basic behavior. A second-order skill is a capacity to produce something which depends on being able to produce the basic behavior. So, for example, suppose we say we're producing a program on interviewing. And we all know that basic behaviors in interviewing include, shall we say, fact-finding questions. So the asking of fact-finding questions we might see as a first-order skill. On the other hand, the asking of fact-finding questions smoothly and with continuity and in a way which relaxes and leads the person you're interviewing isn't a first-order skill. Until you actually have your student able to ask some questions, the chances of them asking those questions smoothly and well linked to other questions and with a sense of timing is a much more difficult thing for people to achieve. Anyway, let's perhaps come back later and argue a little more about the basics. The key point I'm making is that for most people, when we design a program, we're not thinking hard enough about, is that skill a fundamental building block skill? Or is it going to need a building block skill in place that we cannot possibly put in place in the time we have available? Third criterion, which comes actually to the point you're making, John, is you should ask yourself, if you're building a program, have you built a low-threat learning environment? Now, ironically, we're very aware if we have new and very inexperienced people that when we're designing a program we don't want to scare them. But I think one of the issues John is touching on is that the people who are under most threat are experienced people, not inexperienced people, in a skills program, because they feel there is an expectation on them to perform. That's particularly so in an organization like Motorola, which has a lot of long-service people who have a tremendous amount of experience. You suddenly expose them to something in a classroom, and how do we handle it? Well, often we make a major design error. And I've seen it happen over and over again, and it really is worth bringing up and discussing. That's this. You have a program for inexperienced people, and so you're pretty careful to structure it, to build it block by block, to make it very careful and relaxed. Then you know that you have to put on something for experienced people. So what do? You think, well, we better make it advanced because they'll like it better. And we better add some tougher stuff, and better condense the time down. And what you're actually doing is you're greatly increasing the threat level. Now, the so-called advanced programs that tend to be run for people who've got a lot of field experience in any area don't generally have a lot of success. One of the things which we noticed when we went through a lot of programs and the exercise which led to these design criteria was the very few programs for experienced people we liked really were very, very careful indeed. They did go back to basics. They didn't try to do too much. They were very, very careful to recognize that an experienced person trapped in a training situation is under far, far more load and threat than ever a new hire or inexperienced person. And if you are suddenly put on a program where you're told you must put on a training session. And this is a training for non-trainers, how to run a session. And everyone's very aware that you are a professional training person. It's a far, far more threatening thing than if you're asked to do something entirely out of your field, when you can afford to make a fool of yourself. So, although it's motherhood to say we should be very careful that we design a program that doesn't threaten people, that doesn't pressure people when they're new, we must be even more careful when we have experienced people. But perhaps at this stage, all I'd want to say before we go into the criteria in more depth and discuss it around particular training programs is that you must be very careful when you put something into the program thinking that because here's an experienced person, they need tough material. And if you look at the critiques of experienced people of programs, you'll so often find it's the very simplest program which gets the very best critique. Now, it raises some design issues about whether you can use the same design for experienced and inexperienced people. We might want to come on to that. But let me talk about another criterion. It seems very important in a good skills program that there's an incremental build of the skills. Now this is very, very much related to the third criterion. But if you look at programs that you've been through, programs that you feel a lot of respect for, I think you'll agree that they have a feeling of progress, of movement, of development, of shape. I'll talk much more about that later. But at this stage, just let me say that it is a far better learning strategy, and I don't think anyone would be startled at this, to take a skill and build it block by block, if you can, with practice opportunity for each component, rather than try for the whole skill. There are certain exceptions to that. There are certain skills which can only be mastered as a whole skill. Again, if anyone wants to, we can look at some of those in more depth. But one of the things that we found in programs that we felt as designers worked exceptionally well was each piece was a manageable chunk. When that piece was in place, another piece was added. If you look at almost every really fine program, it's based on putting logically piece after piece so there's a shape and a movement through the program design. It's generally not effective to try to teach a whole skill, okay, practice the whole skill again, okay, practice the whole skill again. Actually, there's a very bad reason for this, and one that I rather resent, but it's a fact of life, so let me share it with you. If we talk about people's learning across practice opportunity, so we have practice opportunity in that dimension, and we have L for learning in this dimension. Let's just compare what people actually learn from repeated practice of a skill and what they think they learn. If you look at perceived learning tends to look like this. That is, if we have one practice opportunity, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, the first time people try an exercise, for example, it might be carrying out an interview. The first time they think they learned an awful lot from doing it. Ask them to do the same thing a second time, and their perceived learning is very low, a third and a fourth, fifth, and they get bored as hell. If you can force them through that, they begin to show an improvement again. in terms of their perceived learning. They say, hey, I really am learning some new things. But this dip here, this trough, is a very dangerous one, known under a variety of vulgar names, which we may come on to later. But if you try to measure their actual learning seems to be more like this. In other words, people learn a lot less from doing something once than they do from doing it twice or 3 times or 4 times. So learning, if we take by actual learning, meaning what an observer would see in terms of skills performance, more and more of the skills are displayed, even though people don't feel they're learning anything new. Now, what does this mean in terms of incremental build of skills? It means, among other things, this. Even if it was a good learning strategy to expose the whole skill to a person in one piece and allow them to practice it 5 times, their perceived learning would drop off very rapidly. I think you've all seen how difficult it is to get people to repeat exercises, even though the learning from doing it is often much, much higher than the first time through. Because people look at the novelty of an experience and equate novelty with learning very often. Now, what that does mean in terms of incremental build of skills is one of the ways around that difficulty is to take skills piece by piece, so each time people practice a skill, there is something new about the practice situation. So perceived learning is higher. Especially if you can work a building block approach, so each time through, what people are doing is adding a piece of skill. Anyway, let's have a look at another criterion. Next criterion is, it seems characteristic of good training in terms of design. It's got a learner-centered approach. And you know, when I look at those words, I find them almost impossible to define to you adequately. But it means things like this, that the whole training design starts with the person who's learning, not with the person who's teaching. You get the feeling that as you read through the design, as you actually watch the sessions unfold, that the learner is the person who, firstly, usually has some measure of control and choice. Secondly, has needs that are responded to. The program is built around the needs of those learners as they emerge. Let's take some examples of things which would be learner-centered approaches as opposed to teacher-centered approaches. A lot too many programs are written from the point of view of who is going to instruct them. I've done it myself, you know? Someone says to me, develop a program, and what am I doing? I'm writing instructor notes. I'm writing it very much, here is the storyline of what the instructor does. I think, how can I communicate this to an instructor in order to teach it? I know something which has very much changed the way I design is in the last few years, since this particular experience, I've started off a design by saying, well, we'll figure out later how the instructor is going to handle it. Let's start from the point of view of the learner. The learner comes in and sits down, and what does that person need? What should be happening? What sort of experience is going to occur now? When the learner has been through this session, what are going to be the sorts of doubts they're likely to have? What will be the high spots that we anticipate will be there? How can we capitalize on those? How do we build that in? And I like to just write myself a sort of scenario of what it's going to feel like for a learner going through the program I've designed. And that's really helped me. Because if you think about the design process, the materials development process, we are very commonly developing programs for instructors to instruct, you know? Because we know that the thing we have to churn out 3 weeks from Tuesday is some sort of instructor manual. That's the demand on us, and it's what we're charged to do. Not a lot of programs succeed in transcending that, but the ones that do tend to be very effective programs. And I really like to start from that point of view. And it does alter your perspective. I'm shocked at myself sometimes when I look at programs that I've designed. And I go back and I think, uh-oh, that session, which looked so good, was because I really figured out something which was going to clearly specify what the instructor should do. And then I think, but what's it doing for the learner? Anything? And how's that person feeling and perceiving? And what have they got from it? How are they going to link it and integrate it into other things? And think of good designs you've seen, and good instructional processes you've seen. There's always the implicit assumption that the learner comes first. After all, if you look at a lot of the work on instructional style, what's that really doing except relating very much to the learner and to the learner process? Now, I'd be very happy with this or any other criterion to come back and discuss much more the sorts of designs that do it and that don't. But maybe I ought to move on and see if I can put up a sixth. It seems true of almost any good design that in the design there are frequent and pretty objective progress checks, as we Brits call them, built in to the program itself. Now, what do I mean here? I think we all face at some point issues about measurement in a program, you know? How do you measure its effect? How do you measure the change it brings? It's worth asking, when we're putting that sort of question, who are we talking about as the beneficiary of the measures? Because so often we want to measure for the purposes of the instructor or the designer or the decision maker in the organization. And we forget that the more complex the program, the more the person who really needs the measurement is the learner. Again, think of programs where you have really felt they've had a big impact on you and have been very helpful. There's been the kinds of checkpoints, formal and informal, which have allowed you to feel your baseline skills are moving and something's happening to you. You're going forward. That's so characteristic of a good design. Let's look at some of the ways in which that can be incorporated. Firstly, if you consider the performance of a skill, the difference between an outstanding instructor and a pretty average instructor is an outstanding instructor can give a feeling in skill performance of movement forward through the practice situation. And think how demoralizing it is if you're on a program where you're practicing something and you really don't know whether you're improving or not. It's an issue of design to ensure that the evidence for whether or not that improvement is there is built into the design. Now, I do a little trick with people that unfortunately I can't do with you because this is lined paper with 1-inch squares. And that's this. When I'm talking about skill learning, I'll very often say to people, let's see if we can look at the basis of skill learning. What does it need in order to get skill learning? Well, perhaps if we're setting up an equation, we know that you've got to have practice opportunity. Because if you don't have practice opportunity, you don't learn. And the great discovery of the 1950s was that you didn't learn to swim by reading a book. And you then have the introduction of role plays and simulations and exercises, and a big move towards getting people to perform rather than just to listen. So practice opportunity seems to be tremendously important to skill learning. Now, I then play this sordid trick with people. I say, let's just test this out and teach someone a skill. And I give someone a felt pen. I say, draw me a line 10.5 inches long on the flip chart, which actually can be done very easily here because I can see the squares. People might draw a line like that. You say, okay, now I want to teach you the skill of drawing 10.5-inch lines. So, now draw another, even nearer to 10.5 inches. Practice. The person says, but how long is that? And I say, oh. Practice is what this session is about. Draw another line. So people go, and they keep practicing, and they get pretty random. And then when they draw a particularly disastrous one, that's 18 inches, you stop and you measure them. And you say, okay, practice does not seem to improve a skill. And it's obvious what this demonstration is. It's talking about a missing component, which is feedback, yeah. Now that's a very, very simple, very fundamental issue, and yet it's one where we don't put sufficient attention, I feel, into the design of feedback, into what our rulers and measures are. We often design a program saying, please draw a 10.5-inch line. Okay, everyone done it? Fine, fine. Well, now we're going to have another exercise, and this time we'd like you to draw a 12-inch line. And people are saying, but how long is this one? And I think we've all been on that kind of program, yes? Where you haven't really felt the ruler is there. And of course, I think it's true that there is no skill that can be learnt without feedback. I can't think of one. I'm very willing later to come back to the whole business of how you build those progress checks into a program, what they might look like in different types of programs. At this stage, just let me say that it seems to me characteristic of every good program that I have ever seen that there is that feeling of progress centered around the learner. Hey, I've even not only seen it, but actually been a conspirator in running the kind of program where elaborate measures are taken and then taken away from the students and behind closed doors looked at by the instructors. You know? We very often don't ask ourselves the question, who is the measurement beneficiary and who should it be? So let's have a look at another criterion. A seventh criterion is allied to this one. That's the chance to get maximum practice opportunity in any program. See, very often we carry out calculations about practice opportunity for people which are fundamentally misleading. I saw a couple of weeks ago an advertisement for a sales training program which said this was a splendiferous program where 50% of the program time was spent in opportunity for practice, and therefore people would learn in-depth skills in the 8 hours of program that were available. Now, this was a program designed for 12 people and 1 instructor. It was an 8-hour program. 50% of time devoted to practice sounds pretty good. So let's say that's 4 hours. However, that 4 hours is divided between 12 people, because it's no good everyone going away and practicing by themselves. That's like drawing 10.5-inch lines. The key thing is the instructor or an experienced person there to give the feedback, to give the critique. The way they did that was in 4 hours, 12 people all stood up and did something. Divide that into 12 into 4 sounds to me like 20 minutes a person. Yeah? So when you start looking at it, the amount of practice opportunity, and that is practice plus feedback, was not really great in that program. And yet, it sounds good at 50%. One of the major design challenges in a skills program is how do you increase the amount of practice, but keep that practice consistent with that sixth criterion of feedback. Because increasing practice opportunity alone doesn't do anything. If you say to people, go away into a room and practice, then the chances are that after they've drawn 2 or 3 10.5-inch lines or whatever the task is, that they'll become sufficiently demoralized to go and get coffee and talk and to generally avoid the exercise. The key skill in design is how do you increase practice opportunity plus feedback on that practice. Now there are some very exciting and innovative ways of doing it. Here's where the tape recorder is a wonderful instrument. If you can build good enough measures that students themselves can use, you can, in a group of 12 people, have 6 interactions going on at the same time, 6 skill practices. There are ways in which you can cross-match these designs, which are quite sophisticated, which do ensure that people are getting some adequate feedback on their skills. There's a lot of new thinking and new design technology coming into this area, because it has become very, very apparent that a limiting factor on a program is if people don't have the opportunity to practice, they won't learn. And that practice is too dependent on the instructor. And if you only have one instructor and you have 8 people or 12 people, then you really do have an issue. Because even if 100% of the program was practice time, you'd have a maximum of 1/8 of the program or 1/12 of the program available to people. That's a major issue for me. I'm very happy to talk later about some of the ways we've worked to overcome it. Let me, though, hasten us through another couple of design criteria. Another one is there a specific performance model? Let me underline that word specific. In other words, is it explicitly shown to people what an effective performance looks like? Now, I hope that this will be an area where we can have a lot of interesting argument during the day. There are some people who, on the basis of very meager evidence, say, under no circumstances should you ever show anybody a model of a bad performance in a program. Others say, no, that's not so. One thing that everyone does agree, though, is that you don't learn a skill by watching someone fail to do it. What sort of models can you show people to help them see what it is you're talking about when you're talking about an effective performance? Now, we might ask ourselves quite a lot about behavior modeling. There are some very, very big difficulties just beginning to emerge in behavior modeling methodology. Things that most of the behavior modeling experts haven't really thought through and are getting themselves into tremendous difficulty. After all, those of you who know any behavior modeling programs, like, say, the DDI programs, which are, I think, the best commercially available programs that use behavior modeling, ask yourself, what is a behavior model? It's actually a sequence model rather than a behavior model. It says, here's a sequence of steps to go through in an interaction. Now, a consequence of that immediately is that that's a very difficult model to use if the performer does not have power over the sequence of the interaction. There has never been a good behavior model of negotiation because the sequence is negotiable. There's not really a good behavior model of selling because the customer has the power, and you can't say, well, here is the way this sales call is going to go. First you will. On the other hand, there's very good behavior models of manager behavior, supervisory behavior, counseling behavior, behavior where somebody is in control and can therefore control the sequence. I hope we'll take up some of these things, because for me there's major design issues if you're trying to produce a model where the sequence isn't controlled. I think there are ways to do it. I'm very excited at some of the things just beginning to emerge in this technology. It's certainly not the traditional behavior modeling approach. Another aspect, though, is that word specific that I've underlined. We have a terrible fallacy. And that is, we tend to believe that people learn through principles. And yet, all the evidence is that people don't learn through principles. Hey, if we learned through principles, why do we need all the skills practice? Huh? If we learned through principles, you'll give most things on the back of a postcard and say, now go away and do it. What happens to us in our own experience is this. We have a lot of specific experiences. And then one day we see the link between them. And it's a big aha. Here's the principle. And because of that, the principle to us becomes much more important than the specifics, and we try to communicate it to others through the principle. That's not the way we generally learn it. One of the sad things is programs on the level of principles usually have negligible effect in terms of performance change. I know in my own organization, I just do not let any of my people go to outside programs which begin with the principles of. Because when I was running an evaluation research unit, we really had very, very disappointing results from trying to look at the applications of programs that said, here are the 7 principles of. And ask yourself what it is you use. I mean, it's usually the little specifics, not the principles.
Another question that's raised in my mind is, it seems there might be a danger, depending on how it's presented in design, when you offer a behavior model, that it's presented or just focused on the specific behaviors that you're trying to teach, and that we have to take great care in isolating the other behaviors that are going on, or we run a risk, it would seem, of saying this is the only way, and
yes.
where everyone has their own style, they can still adapt those steps or whatever.
Mm-hmm. In fact, one of the things which I very much like is some of the experimental work going on in organizations like DDI, where they're trying to double model, where they say, here is a model, practice it, try it. Here is an alternative model, a somewhat different way of doing the same thing, using the same steps, but using often different behaviors to get there, trying to build some sort of flexibility into that process. But perhaps we might come on and discuss behavior modeling, because I think it's a very interesting area right now. Just let me put up 2 more, of which this is a very important one. And that is, any really good program, a sign that it's good is it's exciting to teach and to learn. Because, you know, a skills program in a way has a slight element of theatre. Yeah? It's got a plot, it's got a shape, it's got a storyline. One of the things actually that makes me feel, just in aesthetic terms, that it's often not good to put principles first. I don't think I would put principles first if I was, for example, writing a play, where I'd say, well, the punchline is that the person who committed the murder was, now let's watch the play. You know? It's very often true that we are designing a piece of theatre. I don't mean that in the sense that we're designing a piece of deception. But what I mean is, we're designing an experience which has a continuity, a storyline, which seems to unfold, which involves people in that process. Consequently, I always admire the kind of design which leaves people at the end of the day with a significant thought, so that when they go out of the classroom, they really are talking about something. I think, that's like ending the first act, you know, on a rather key line. I always like the sort of program which has people wanting the next piece because it's going to resolve the last piece. Any program which is boring to teach ultimately becomes boring to learn. You know? And I think we have to do often a much better job of saying, how do we inject a little excitement, a little energy? Now, often, I think there's temptations to do that for the wrong reason, you know? This is a dull program, a little pizzazz somewhere. Can't we put the materials in 2 colors or something? I fall into that one very often. What I'm talking about here is something more fundamental. I'm really talking about how do you make an experience unfold? How do you make it come alive and live? Just as you would a piece of theatre. I think for each of us, if you think of programs you've been through or experiences you've been through where you really learned something, there is that feeling of movement. The storyline is going along. It's not a lot of disconnected things. The excitement is in seeing the plot unfold and seeing the integration. That's the kind of design that's hardest to go for, because especially if you're really ruthlessly looking towards performance-based design, you're looking at a very scientific process, a very quantified, a very measured, an exact process. One of the things you have to watch out for is that it's horribly easy to allow that to rule the excitement of the design. Let me, though, look at the 10th and maybe the most important criterion, especially if your objective is to impact on the way people perform in their jobs. And that's this. You have to ask, does the program have a link to some form of on-the-job reinforcement? Because if you don't have that link, your chances of success are very, very limited. And let me put up a couple of simple little models which illustrate, unfortunately, one of the most dismal of all conclusions you can draw about training. That's this. It would seem, if we take an ideal, if we look at what in big letters should happen in an ideal piece of training, and you'll notice during the day I will draw a zillion of these 2-axis graphs. If we're trying to measure here improvement in performance, and along this axis we're measuring time, I'd like you to assume that at some point we're going to put in a piece of training just here, at this point in time. Let's put a T for training. So what is going to happen is we're going to take somebody performing at a given level, put them through a piece of training, and we'll see what it is that happens. Well, suppose the objective of the training is to teach people a change of behavior, to teach them a new behavior, whatever that might be. Incidentally, notice there I'm putting something almost on the level of a principle. It might have been more effective as a piece of communication to say, suppose we're teaching people to ask more questions in an interview, or something of this sort. Anyway, never mind, I can break my own rules if no one else can. Here is somebody who is using a certain behavior at a particular level, and we put them through training which aims to increase the behavior. Theoretically, we're looking for something like this to happen to the behavior. That during the training, it begins to change. After the training, when people have all the practice opportunity that the job affords, it changes even more and ultimately approaches a performance peak. Now that's a very nice piece of theory. Let's also look at something which is possibly the most important distinction that you can make. there is a very important distinction to make between a behavior and the result of a behavior. I paused for a long while because I've once again given you a statement on a level of principle. I think it becomes more effective to understand it if you say, let's take an example of what I mean. Before I take the example, let me look at the result of a behavior. Let's assume a behavior is getting this sort of result. We have no measurement of the result during training. People learn a new behavior or an improved behavior. What does it do to their results? It looks as though this sort of curve is characteristic. The results of a behavior don't follow behavior change exactly. That is, results lag behind, and there is this phenomenon known to the technical as an incorporation lag, but known to simple-minded people like me as a results dip. I've made a point to you on the level of principle. Now let me make it in a much more specific kind of way. I will give you an example of performance by showing you a little device I have here. This is a Garklein flutlein. It's a small musical instrument, originally from Saxony in the 15th century. It went out of fashion irretrievably. The crumhorn was beating the hell out of this in the marketplace of Central Europe all through the late 15th, early 16th centuries, because it's excruciatingly difficult to play and it sounds lousy. Not a good sort of product to have on the market. And the recorder was really making inroads against this. Now, just to illustrate that I'm not giving you total bullshit, let me play a bar or two on it so now I can make a noise. So I can make a noise. Now, is the noise that you hear my behavior or the result of my behavior? The noise you hear is the result. What's the behavior that brings the result? How I blow, what I do with my fingers, yeah? Now, let's now me as a case study in what can easily happen in terms of behavior. If that's what should happen, I'm now going to tell you a sob story about what actually happens by looking at exactly the same graph in my own case, and this time instead of the theory, what actually happens, which tends to look much more like this. If again we're measuring improvement here, and we're measuring time here, and here's the piece of training, let's take exactly what you have just seen, namely my behavior in the performance of a skill. Here I am, and the behavior I'm looking at is how I use my fingers. Now, I go along to a lesson with my teacher, and my teacher says, Neil, notice when you play this, you tend to keep your fingers very high. You let them raise up off the keys. See, they're up there. And my teacher says you should try and keep them low. It's much harder. But, she says, if you don't keep your fingers low, you'll never learn to play the fast passages. So I want you to change your behavior. I want you to practice keeping your fingers low. So, while I'm with her, I keep my fingers low. Now, do you think it sounds better when I first try to keep my fingers low? Not in the least. I'm changing my behavior, but the results at first don't immediately follow the behavior. Change your grip in a sport, and is the next game better? Almost certainly not. You go down. Yeah? Change your style of training, and does the next session you run feel more comfortable, more assured? Does it go smoothly? Chances are not. In almost any performance change, there is a lag between using the behavior and the behavior bringing results. So what happens? Here's the results, the sound that comes out. I try the new behavior, and down it goes. It's not bringing results, so I abandon it. That's the most characteristic curve. As soon as the results are looking bad, I go back to my old behavior. So here I am, a few thousand miles from my teacher, and up go my fingers. And we all do it, don't we? Now this is the most crucial and critical of all things to hit at training effectiveness. Because if you're teaching people a skill, you are always going to be a victim of the results dip. Because how do you judge my performance as people who are listening? You judge by the results. You're not going to reinforce and reward me for using the right behavior, because as far as you're concerned, you're just listening to the sound it makes. How does a sales manager, for example, judge salespeople in terms of either using the right behavior or are they getting the orders? Are they getting the orders? How does a manager judge any of his supervisors in terms of how they're handling their people? Not by are they using the right behavior, but is it getting results? And often the right behavior is going to have to go through an incorporation period before the results will come. Now, as we begin to explore the consequences of that, the consequences of it are horrendous. In Xerox Corporation, for example, we once did a study which showed that if we take the amount of change brought about by training as being 100% of learning, there's an 87% loss in the programs we studied within a month. Now, I feel a little less complacent about that sort of loss when you put it in terms of 87 cents in the skills dollar have gone down the drain within a month. Because skills training is an expensive business, and that's a loss that literally cannot be afforded. So we have to ask ourselves, if we're in the smiles business, that doesn't really matter. Because if people perceive that they've got a lot out of the training, it doesn't matter whether they apply it or not. Hey, they go away as satisfied customers, and in fact that dip, that results dip, can help us. One of the things which we found, which has always rather delighted me, was about the guilt feelings that people get following training when they don't apply the lessons of the training. One of the ways of resolving the guilt feelings is to say it's splendid training and everyone else should go through it. You know, and you get very good reports back on the training even when you don't necessarily get performance change, because people feel it's their fault they haven't performed. I know I should have done. I'm like that with my Gurklein-Flutlein teacher. I don't blame her, because I know that she's right. But I do feel an inadequacy in me. And consequently, I would recommend anyone to go to her to be trained. Hey, she's great. But I still raise my fingers. Now, what is your criterion of success? The satisfied customer or the satisfied customer who changes performance? Now, in a way, we're talking about what is potentially a temporary phenomenon. You see, if we look at what should happen, it's pretty clear that if we were to just block off this immediate period and move out to here, there is no performance problem. The moment I keep my fingers low and it sounds better, I've not got a problem, I'll keep doing it, because it's working. The moment when you've changed your grip, you find you're playing better, you'll keep going at it. The moment you're handling a disciplinary interview in a different way and you begin to see it's getting you results, you're fine. Because when the results build up, the results are self-reinforcing. They reinforce the behavior and the behavior keeps going. It's in that intermediate stage that you have to have something else. And it's here that you have to build in some form of on-the-job reinforcement. The question becomes, how do you reinforce the behavior until the behavior brings results? If you haven't got an answer to that question, then an 87% loss is not at all uncharacteristic, that was an 87% loss and what I regard as quite a good program. Now, for me, this is a truly fundamental issue in training design. And it becomes a fundamental issue if you switch your philosophy as a training organization away from being an organization which exists to put on things in the classroom that please people, towards an organization which has a measurable productivity and business impact. Because in one case, what I've said here doesn't matter too much. In the other case, it should be your biggest single worry about any program that you design or run.